Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Thank you all for being here with us this week. I know every week I talk about my special guest, and this week is no exception. It's just an extra special guest because Tasha Walsh is a dear friend of mine and colleague, and we have worked together throughout the years. And Tasha is a licensed clinical social worker. She is also the executive director of the Rockbridge Area Hospice organization, and she's here today wearing two hats. She's going to speak to us a little bit about hospice to really help all of our listeners understand what it is. And then we will talk about Tasha's personal story with her mom. And I could not be more honored and delighted to have you here today with us, Tasha. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me, Susan.
So let's just start with the big picture. Why don't you talk to our listeners? What is hospice? I think there's a lot of misunderstandings around what it is. So I would love for you just to speak to us to get us all on the same page.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate the question and the opportunity because you're right. There is a lot of misconception about hospice. Most people in the US think of hospice care as what happens like in the last days of life. And, somebody hears, oh, they've brought in hospice. That means grandma's going to die in 2 days or something like that. And that's really unfortunate because what hospice care really is a level of service and a combination of services, including nursing visits, social work, chaplaincy, volunteers, all kinds of supportive services, both for the person who's reaching the end of their life and their circle of support, all of the caregivers and the family that love that person. And what it really is designed to do is to support that person and their circle of support so that they really can focus on living their life as best they can for as long as they can, even if that is just a few months or a few weeks or a few days. But the earlier that hospice services are brought in, the better able that support team is to be able to come in and reduce the stress level of the family and everything that's going on and the grief that's coming up, because you know what's happening down the road and nobody knows when. But there are things that we know about end-of-life care that professionals in a hospice organization can help everybody prepare for. It's not as scary. You're not alone. You kind of start understanding what are the signs and symptoms to be aware of and how to keep people comfortable and how to keep people engaged in life until they can't be engaged in life anymore. And so that's really what hospice is about. We often have comments that we hear from people after we've provided hospice care for them and their loved one has passed away. We wish we had brought you in sooner. I mean, we hear that so often. So I think if any message could be learned by the masses, is hospice is not a bad word. It doesn't mean giving up hope. And really what it means is being able to get the support that is necessary to focus on life for as long as possible.
And so just some of these misconceptions, a couple of things. In order to have hospice, though, the patient can't also be still engaged in other treatments, correct?
That depends. That is something that is true if the patient has Medicare insurance, but a lot of private insurances are now starting to allow for hospice care, which is a level of palliative care, along with other types of care that may be considered curative in the past. And even Medicare is starting to look at that a little bit differently. I think there's more of a recognition that, diseases sometimes get to a point where there really is no cure, but there are things that can be done to help ease the pain, ease the discomfort, perhaps prolong life a little bit, but it's not going to cure the illness. That it depends kind of an answer. That is true for Medicare, but for a lot of other private insurances and even some Medicare Advantage insurance companies now are allowing for what they call concurrent treatment, where you can get the hospice care as well as some interventions that in the past would be considered curative and would not have been allowed. So it is changing.
That's great news.
Yeah.
Because I know that was not true even when my mom was dying. So would the recommendation be then for people who don't know, who would look into that? If they call a hospice program, would the hospice staff be the ones to call insurance to find out whether or not that the insurance that patient has would cover concurrent treatments?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I
Yeah.
want to pivot now into your story because it is a powerful story. It is a beautiful story. And it also took such tremendous courage, I think is the best word that comes up for me when I think about what you were able to do for your own mother around hospice when she was in a foreign country. So, can you set the stage for us? Tell us a little bit about your mom and what was going on at the time that you set this up for your mother.
Yeah. So my mom was a really amazing individual. She was very adventurous. She always loved to travel. And she always had the dream of retiring in a Latin American country. She loved Latin America. She loved the culture. She spoke Spanish fluently, traveled down there a lot throughout her life. And she was able to retire to Cuenca, Ecuador, about a little over 10 years ago now, I guess. And she loved it. I mean, she just fell into that community like butter on toast. And she started a theater down there. She sang in an international multilingual choir. I mean, she just had all of these friends and she was very engaged. And she was not the healthiest person, but she also wasn't somebody who had a ton of chronic illnesses or, was always sick. But she did have some health issues a few years ago that were treated down there. And she was doing fine. And when the pandemic started, she, like everybody else, went inside and didn't get out a lot. But she was also just really, even in that, she was very engaged. She just picked up all these books and she would read a book in English and then she'd get the Spanish translation and she'd read it in that. And then, started learning how to play piano. She took piano lessons. So she was very, very active and very engaged in life. And what happened was in December of 2020, so we were in the middle of the pandemic, the vaccines were just starting to come out. I work in healthcare, so I was fortunate that I was able to get my first vaccine early on, but I got a call, it was right around New Year's, from a young woman. I got a text from a young woman who worked with my mom as a kind of a housekeeper and companion. And she basically told me that my mom was really sick and was in the hospital. And I found a friend who spoke Spanish. I speak some Spanish, but I was having trouble understanding what was actually going on. And so I found a friend who spoke Spanish and found out that my mom had become very sick and some of her friends got her into a hospital where they had done a bunch of tests on her liver and her kidneys. And it was all very confusing because I'm trying to understand this in a foreign language with medical terminology and things like that. And long story short, she was in the hospital for about 10 days. And I was spending a lot of time on the phone and texting people down there and trying to make sure that I knew what was going on and we could figure out what we needed to do. There was a lot of concern about being able to access her bank account to be able to pay for the hospitalization because the system down there it's very affordable, but you have to pay cash at the time of service. So, her 10-day stay and all the medications and all the tests and everything was like maybe $4,000, but, you had to have cash. And so when she was discharged, they said that she was doing okay and she was going to take her a little bit of time to recover. And so then I was on the phone with her and she was feeling better, but her cognitive abilities weren't quite there. Like she would sit and talk to me about what was going on and everything like that, but she couldn't remember how to log into her Gmail account, So she fortunately had some very good friends down there that set up round the clock care for her and got nurses to come in. And so she was there, she was with people all the time. And we ended up wiring money down there to pay for it.
I want to slow you down for a minute because because just hearing the story, my heart is starting to race, like thinking about if this were my mom and you're trying from Virginia, from a different country, you are trying to navigate. First of all, you're trying to figure out what is going on with your mother and you are trying to navigate all of these different things. What's happening for you emotionally in dealing with the complexity of your mother's healthcare needs and also you as the daughter, and it's the pandemic. And I'm sure you were like, what should I do? Should I fly there? I mean, you probably couldn't even get into the country at that point, right? I mean, what is happening for you?
I just kind of went into kind of like, okay, we just need to figure this out. And my emotions probably took a back seat because it was just like there was so much going on that just needed to be figured out. I was worried, and I had planned to go down and visit her in the fall of 2020 before the pandemic hit. So I really just kind of took a very logical kind of like, okay, we need to do this. We need to figure out this. We need to figure out this. And so what happened was I started realizing that her memory was not returning the way that you would expect it to. And that's actually pretty common for elderly folks that have a long stay in the hospital. And she was
And
like
what
70s.
did they ever diagnose what was going on with your mother? You said they
It
took
was,
all of these tests.
yeah, they said it was something with her kidneys, but then they also talked about her liver and her pancreas. I mean, there was a lot of confusion, and it was not her regular doctor who was working at this hospital. Emotionally, I think what was so hard for me was just not being there and not being able to get clarity about what was really going on. So I decided that I just needed to go down there. And my husband and my sisters also, we were all in agreement. And as soon as I walked in her apartment, she burst into tears. I burst into tears. Her friends, I mean, it was just like everybody burst into tears.
I'm going to burst into tears.
Because her friends were telling me, Tasha, she really needs family here to help figure this out. We can't figure this out. And it became very clear to me within just the course of a couple hours that there was more going on than we realized. Just her energy level, her strength was not good. So I got there on a Saturday, and I found the information for her main doctor that she had been seeing for a decade, that she was there. And for whatever reason, her friends didn't know about this doctor, and so had never called him when she was sick. So they had taken her to a different doctor, which was fine. But I got her an appointment Monday morning with her regular doctor, and he ran just a couple more tests, looked over all the medical history and everything like that. And he was really concerned. He was just like, Juanita, I've never seen you like this. And he said that he was going to run these tests, and he was going to make a house call the next day on Tuesday afternoon. He would come to her apartment and kind of, talk about what's going on and figure out what's what. That afternoon, he texted me and he said, I'd like for you to come to my office tomorrow morning. I want to talk to you. And I was like, okay, shit, excuse me. It's just like, I kind of knew what that meant. He didn't want me to bring my mom. He just said, no, I just want to talk to you. I'll still do the house visit Tuesday afternoon. So I got a friend of hers to come over and stay with my mom Tuesday morning so I could go meet with him. And it turns out she had entered into end-stage renal failure and also had leukemia. And he said that he couldn't tell just from that test what kind of leukemia it was, but they could do some additional tests if, we wanted to narrow it down. But it was at a very high level, white blood counts or whatever it was they looked at. And that plus the kidney failure, that any treatments that could be potentially recommended for leukemia weren't an option. And he basically said, I recommend you get her on a plane and get her back to the States as soon as you can to set up care for her. And I said, well, that's great. Well, not great, but I said, well,
I know what you mean.
I said, well, the thing is, our mom has said for years that she loves Cuenca. She feels like it's home. She doesn't ever see herself living in the States again. And after she dies, don't bother bringing her body back. And he said, okay, well, in that case, I'll do what I can to help. And the other thing I asked him, in hospice care, we often talk about a prognosis of weeks to months or days to weeks or hours to days, you never know, but, that just kind of gives you a general idea of how long somebody's going to be around. And so I asked him, what he thought, and he said days to weeks. So I had planned to be there for 2 weeks. I ended up staying for close to a month. And one of the things that I'm so grateful for is my mom was a very organized person. And so she had everything organized and she was getting ready to downsize. So she had already identified places for a lot of her things to go. And when the doctor came that afternoon to talk to her and give her the diagnosis and the prognosis, her reaction was, well, I've lived a really good life and I'm so grateful for it and it's okay. And then she told me later, she said, Tasha, would you go get my phone and my address book? I have a lot of phone calls I want to make. And so we spent the next 2 weeks, basically, she was lying on the couch and she would call people and just talk to them on the phone about, memories and how grateful she was that they were in her life. And it was just a really beautiful way to pass that time.
What was going on for you? I am going to cry, but what was going on for you? Because I can imagine you as the daughter sitting there and you're a therapist. I know your heart, because sometimes I think in the role that we play, even if it's with family, you're holding both at the same time, like that emotion as a daughter. And then also here you are as the executive director of a hospice, like all of these things, right? I'm not going to put words in your mouth. What was the experience like for you?
It was intense, to put it mildly. I mean, there was a part of me that just really wanted to make things easy for her. And I was also just so honored to be a witness to all the phone calls that she had and all the conversations, because she really was so weak. She didn't really have the energy to hold a phone up to her ear. So she had just had it on speakerphone lying in front of her, and I would dial and she sometimes would get confused and repeat herself. But just the laughter and the love and the connection and the appreciation that people shared for her and that she shared for other people. And I'll never forget, after I don't remember who she was talking to, but she hung up the phone and she was just like, well, I guess I have made a difference. And she called people that she hadn't talked to for 10 years, and people that she had gone to graduate school with several decades ago, and tons of family. And it was just really, really lovely to watch her have that time to connect. And yeah, it was really lovely. And I think for me, I made a point of like going for walks or a bike ride every single day just to have a little bit of time outside. And she had so many friends coming, that was not a problem. Actually, sometimes the problem was like not having too many friends right after the other or at the same time. I'd get her comfortable in bed and then I would just veg on her porch for a little while, listen to music. And I watched Bridgerton. That was
That's awesome.
It was after the first season of Bridgerton came out. I'd heard about it. I'd never watched it. And I was like, all right. So that was a lot of fun. That was my evening entertainment.
What was the process like for you to say goodbye to your mom?
It was very sweet and hard at the same time. She and I have not always had the easiest relationship. And one of the things that was really nice for me was to be able to be there and to support her in a time of need and not feel resentful for it, because there have been times in our lives where she has called on me or needed me and I've, had to help her out or something. And, there'd be some resentment there. I would be like, why am I having to do this, Mom? So it was very healing for me to be able to be there and do that because I wanted to, and I was able to, and I was really grateful that I was able to do that. Yeah. I was also very grateful that I had the hospice experience and knowledge and a team of people back in the States, because the doctor down there was super and very helpful. And then we also found a woman who had been trained in the US and had worked at a hospice in the US to help us too. But they don't, hospice care is not something that they really have in Ecuador. People either die in the hospital hooked up to machines, or they die at home with their family, but without any medical assistance in terms of staying comfortable or anything. So when my mom's physical comfort level got to the point where she needed more and more medication to not be in pain, I was on the phone talking to my team in the US, and then I would communicate to the doctor down there about what my team was saying. And then he'd say, well, we don't have that medication here, but we have these medications. And I'd say, okay, well, what is, so it was like a lot of back and forth just in terms of like what medications were available that up here in the States, we just kind of take for granted, and figuring out a combination of medications to help her be comfortable. And then even things like, and this may sound really silly, but at the end of life, one of the biggest things in helping people stay comfortable is keeping their mouth moist, because at some point, they just stop being interested in drinking water or being able to drink water. So they have these things in the US that are mouth swabs, and it looks like a toothbrush, but it's got a sponge on the end. And you just dip it in water and you just kind of swab the person's mouth. And that's just, it's just a thing. And it's really easy. They're not that expensive. They're just there in the drugstores, but they don't have those in Ecuador. And so I felt like MacGyver. My mom had these old fashioned foam hair curlers. And I took them and I cut them up and found then these long wooden skewers. So I made my own mouth swabs out of hair curlers to use.
Tasha, that's brilliant. I mean, because my mother had a severe stroke. She was in ICU. She had multiple bone breaks. I mean, so those little swabs of keeping, and like you said, it sounds silly, but it's not. It's at, end stage life, but also what was happening with my mom. If somebody is in ICU, whatever, they can't swallow. Sometimes they stop swallowing water. And all of these things are little tiny things to care and provide some level of comfort. So like I could ball just thinking about you having the wherewithal to even think about creating a swab to keep her mouth moist, really. Like, so what you were doing as daughter, you were the daughter, but you were coordinating hospice care and patching it together and doing all of these little things that we take for granted completely in the United States. I just think that is so beautiful. I mean, I just can imagine it. Of course, I'm thinking about my own mom right now and what that experience must have been like for you, because you had this knowledge, which so many of us do not have. Where do you even begin? Because you wanted to honor your mother's wishes of being home. She did not want to fly back to the States, which would have made it easier for you if you could have flown her back. But that is not what she wanted. She wanted, and that you wanted to keep her in her home. And so you had to do a lot of different things to coordinate, to get the medicine, to keep her comfortable. So I just want to acknowledge that. I think that's incredible.
Yeah, thanks. I felt like I was the right person to be there. My sisters were incredibly supportive, and I was texting them all the time, and I was calling my uncle every day and my husband every day. And I have one sister that lives in Ireland, and there was no way that they weren't allowing people out of the country there. And I have another sister in Colorado, and she had booked a flight to come down to be with us, but then ended up getting COVID right before she was supposed to come, so couldn't make it. But I think of the three of us, I was probably the one best suited to be there because of that experience and that knowledge that I have. And like I said earlier, I mean, my mom and I did not have the greatest relationship throughout our lives. I mean, I always loved her and I respected her and I enjoyed her company for a couple of days at a time, kind of a thing, So, and then I needed to put some boundaries up. So it was really healing for me to, I mean, when you asked earlier about what it was like, just hearing all those phone calls, I mean, it was really, really helpful to just be able to see her from a different perspective, and we had some very lovely conversations, and she really expressed her love and her pride. And not just me, but my sisters and all of her grandkids. I mean, she got on the phone with all three of my kids and my other two nephews and just was very specific also about things that she really appreciated and was proud of them for. And at one point she asked me for forgiveness. She said, "Can you ever forgive me?" And she had been talking about, some things that had happened early on in childhood. She was very angry and I was the eldest, so I got the brunt of a lot of her anger. It was just really nice, and just nice moments of just pure forgiveness and acceptance and love.
I think that's why your story is so powerful, and why I wanted you to share it so much, because I know you had those struggles with your mom. And one thing I think about with our parents is that we often don't see them as human and flawed.
Yeah.
We expect so much from our parents, right? And so we, as children, we have these experiences, and as we get older, we can have some pretty profound grudges against our parents, right? Depending on what our experience is. And I think that often it's hard for us, as I just said, to think of them as human beings who are flawed and have had their own history, right, that have influenced who they are. And what I love so much about your story is that it is never too late to forgive. It is never too late to offer that space and grace for us all to be human, because that forgiveness with your mom, I think that as therapists, we talk about this. Forgiveness really is about us, right? Because the anger, the resentment eats us up. But it is such a mutual gift to the person that we are offering our forgiveness to, and to let it go, right? To let all of that, all of the anger go. And so I would love for you to share with our listeners that the end of life with your mom and saying goodbye, and what you've done, what that process, how that process has influenced and helped you along your grief journey with your mom.
Yeah, well, at the very end, she was medicated to sedation. She was not consciously aware or interacting. And I remember at one point I was there by myself, and I had just turned her over or something. And I think I probably had just swabbed her mouth with the mouth swab or something. And I just said, "I hope I'm doing a good job, Mom." And there was just the faintest little grin on her face. And it was probably there before. Maybe it was just because her mouth was now moist, you never, but anyway, for me, it was just like an affirmation that I was doing a good job, that I was helping her make that transition. And the night she died, I had tucked her in and put the covers around, and she had these little teddy bears. And so I had the teddy bears around her and just kissed her goodnight. And I kind of had a feeling that she probably would be passing pretty quickly, because her breathing had changed and her heart rate had gone through all of the things that the body goes through as it's shutting down. And I went to bed, and she had a cat. And when I woke up the next morning, the cat was in the room with me, staring at me. And I knew something was different, because the cat didn't do that. The cat was always with my mom on her bed. And I went into the room, and I think she probably had just taken her last breaths shortly before I went in there. And so I sat with her for a few minutes before calling anybody, and just cried and just thanked her and loved her. And one of the things I thanked her for was being so organized too, because she really made it very easy then to kind of finish up all of her affairs. It could have been a real disaster trying to have to do something like that in a foreign country, but it was not at all. And I was really very grateful for that. She made it easy.
I keep thinking about you being there by yourself, and which can be a gift, right? When you are by yourself and you can be in the space that you need to be. But here you are alone in this foreign country, and your mom has passed, and you've had this incredible spiritual time. That's the only other way I can think of it is, and as people know, have read my book, right? Like, my family wasn't over there in Hong Kong when I saw my brother. And so I think what comes to mind for a question is that you come back, because it's almost surreal in so many ways, right? Because you're sort of in this incubation, like you're just alone with this experience. And I know you're having the conversations, but it is not the same as physically being there. And then you come home to your life, right? And it's very difficult to explain the experience of what you have been through. How did you re-enter your life after this incredibly emotional and spiritual experience that you've had? Was the integration hard for you?
There definitely was a period of pause. And I think that's part of it, is I gave myself permission to not just like jump right back in. And I had a few days after she died, I had a few days down there wrapping some things up and then just really enjoying the city that she loved so much, and having lunch with some of the friends that she loved so much. And so that was really sweet. And so when I came home, I don't know, I guess I just gave myself grace. So if I was sad, I cried. If I wanted to laugh through memories, I laughed through memories. If I just didn't want to think about it at all, I didn't think about it at all. I wrote kind of a eulogy of the experience that I read at her memorial. We did a Zoom memorial about a week or so after I got back. And I think that just giving myself that time and that space. And I mean, that's one of the nice things about working in end of life care, because everybody understands what you're going through. So they don't expect you to just like jump right back in and like get over it already or anything. But I think that really helped. And I think just being able to have been there without the resentment and really be in that place of getting myself to a space of seeing her in a different perspective. She was way more than just my nutty mom who got on my nerves, and that made it a lot easier for me in the year since. Yeah.
I know that we're coming to the top of the hour and you've shared so much with us, I think, to give us all food for thought. But a couple of things I want to point out so they don't get lost is I think that those of us that have that, and I do think it's a gift when we are able to have end of life with somebody that we love, because as people will have shared with me, when you lose somebody quickly and tragically, the one thing I hear over and over is I never got to say goodbye, right? And so being able to say goodbye and tell that person what they mean to you and how much you love them is such a gift that so many of us don't ever get. Which is why I always say, always end your conversations with, I love you. But what I heard, a couple of things, I've already talked about the forgiveness, but you took care of yourself through this as much as you could, and I know you well enough to know that you are good at taking care of yourself. And one thing I think we are all not so great at is when we're in deep grief is remembering to do the small things. And I'm talking about eating and sleeping and getting exercise and giving ourselves that grace not to jump back in. Sometimes people don't have that luxury either. They've got to go right back to work. But you, both in your own personal experience, but also in what you know about your work, what else can you offer to our listeners in ways that they can take care of themselves during their deep grief?
I think that if there's one thing I would say, it would be to feel the feelings as fully as you can. And know that the feeling itself is something that the intensity of the feeling does pass. And then what comes after that is the deep richness of the love that existed and still exists, which is why the feelings are so intense. So for me, it's kind of like being able to recognize and honor the pain as an indication of the reality and the strength of the love.
I can't possibly add to that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this beautiful story that now I have to pull it together. But I want to thank you. And I want to thank all of our listeners for being here with us today. And we will be having a very special episode coming in the next, I'm not sure when, of having Tasha's hospice team. So we will really get to hear the different perspectives of the incredible, miraculous work that these hospice teams are out there doing. So thank you, Tasha, and thank you, listeners, and we'll see you guys here next week. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Leap, please subscribe, share it with others, or leave a rating and review so others can benefit from this content. Be sure to check out the show notes for resources related to this episode. And to catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at susan.casey. If you have a transformational story to share on grief and loss, please email me at leapwithsusan@gmail.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.